Tonight's story takes us far from the comforts of modern life. We journey back to the late Middle Ages, a time when the air itself felt thick with dread, and each sunrise brought no promise, only more questions. You'll walk the muddy paths of a plague-ridden village where fear clings like frost and hope is as rare as bread. It's not a tale of heroes, but of endurance, of quiet strength in forgotten places. The bell of St. Eldwyn's tolls faintly in the gray morning, its sound swallowed by the heavy mist coiling through the muddy village lanes. Somewhere nearby, a crow calls once, then vanishes into the fog like a secret never meant to be told. The day begins again, another day of trying to survive. Before we go deeper into this story, where you'll meet souls clinging to hope in a world ravaged by plague and poverty, consider supporting the channel with a like and a subscription. This helps us bring more quiet stories from long-forgotten times to those who need rest, peace, or a little escape. Now, let the tale unfold. Aileen rose before the light did, though these days the sky barely changed between night and morning. Her knees ached from the dampness that clung to the floor like mold. She sat up slowly, pulling the threadbare shawl over her shoulders, careful not to wake the child beside her. Not her child, not really, just one left behind, who cried less than the others and slept more. That was enough. The room was little more than boards and wind, a roof in name only, straw piled against the corners to keep out rats and the worst of the chill. She reached for the tin cup she'd left by the hearth. No embers now, only cold stone and yesterday's ash. The cup was empty, but she lifted it to her lips anyway. The ghost of warm water, enough to start the day. Outside, the lane was slick with last night's rain. Earth and waste churned together into a thick, familiar stink. The pigs rooted near the broken cart again, their snouts black with rot. Aileen stepped past them, head down, shawl drawn tighter. No one made eye contact anymore. Eyes could carry things. Illness, grief, blame. At the far end of the lane, near the chapel ruins, she passed the body. Still there. No one had moved it. She paused. The face was half covered with cloth, eyes closed, mouth open. A boy, maybe 15. He'd been coughing 3 days ago, near the well. She remembered his mother, shouting at him to stay home, swearing she'd chain him if he tried to fetch water again. The well had run dry yesterday. She didn't look long, just enough to know he was gone and that no one had dared touch him. A scrap of linen covered his chest. A mercy or a warning. Back in the village square, 2 men were arguing in whispers. One had a sack of dried beans tied with twine. The other held nothing but a knife and desperation. They didn't notice her. Women didn't interrupt men's business, even when it was bartering for survival, even when it was about nothing at all. The church bell rang again, not for mass, not for prayer, just to remind the living they were still counted. Barely. Aileen turned down the lane behind the baker's hut. The chimney was cold. No bread today. Likely not tomorrow either. She paused near the alley where a figure was crouched against the wall, wrapped in a cloak that might once have been red. A gloved hand reached out silently. She placed half a heel of bread into it without speaking. The figure nodded once. This was how things were now. No names, no thanks, just the ritual of not letting die. She returned to her corner of the world. By midday, the child was still sleeping. A good sign, or not. It was hard to know any more. Sleep was easier than hunger. She lit a stub of candle, the last one, and watched the flame bend in the draft. Outside, someone screamed, a short scream, sharp, like when boiling water spills on skin. Then nothing. She did not go to the door. Instead, Aileen sat, folded her hands around her stomach, and pressed gently, as though trying to remember what it felt like to be full, or warm, or young. She was 32, or so she guessed. Time had stopped meaning anything when the fever came. Tomorrow, she thought, maybe I will go to the convent. They are still giving broth if you can stand the prayers. But she doubted they'd take her. They had rules. They always had rules. The candle guttered. The child stirred. Rain began again. It always sounded like whispers when it hit the slate. And so the day ended, quiet, dull, like breath that barely filled the lungs. Another day survived, which in these times was the closest thing left to victory. The wind carried the stench before the sound came, a sour, wet odor that crept through every crack in the shutters and settled in the back of the throat. Aileen had smelled it before. In spring, when the tanner's apprentice died and they buried him shallow and quick. In summer, when the animals sickened and no one dared eat the meat. But this was different, sharper, hungrier. She rose again before light. The child beside her was breathing, soft and steady, curled like a kitten under the cloth. A small mercy. In the square, 3 men stood near the well. None of them spoke. One held a hammer, another a rope. The third had nothing at all, just eyes red from tears and fists balled so tightly the knuckles had gone white. A cart stood beside them, the kind used for hay in better times. But there was no hay now, only a bundle wrapped in rough wool, stiff at the edges, unmoving. She didn't ask who it was. The man with the rope stepped forward, touched the bundle like it might wake up. Then he turned away quickly and spat on the ground. The man with the hammer nailed a board across the well's opening. The sound echoed through the square, 1, 2, 3, like the toll of a funeral bell that no one could afford to ring. Water, then, was gone. Aileen went back home with half a bucket of rain she'd collected in a broken basin. It smelled of soot and mildew, but she strained it through cloth and offered it to the child anyway. He drank slowly, eyes open but blank, like someone looking through a window rather than out of it. That evening, the fever took another. Old Marta lived 3 houses down, or what used to be houses. Her door had been ajar since midsummer. People said she'd stopped locking it once she lost her son. No one knew for sure how many days she'd been gone. They found her half naked on the floor, skin mottled dark like bruised fruit, eyes wide open and dry. Someone said she'd died smiling. Someone else said her face had just frozen that way. No one cried. By now, it was clear. This wasn't a sickness. It was a reckoning, a judgment, a thinning of the world. The priest stopped holding service. He said God no longer heard prayers said in groups, but he kept the chapel for himself. From her corner, Aileen saw fewer people each day. Some fled, To where, no one knew. Some locked themselves in and were never seen again. A few simply vanished between dusk and dawn, leaving behind only ash in the hearth and food still rotting on the table. And still, the bell rang. Not every hour now, just once or twice a day, to remind them that someone still lived to ring it. One morning, Aileen watched a procession pass through the main road. 6 figures, cloaked and hooded, faces hidden. One carried a wooden cross, another dragged a sack of dried herbs, the scent bitter and acrid even at a distance. They chanted low, Latin perhaps, though the words made little sense. Pestis venit, remissio orbis. Children watched from windows. No one joined them. No one stopped them. They disappeared into the fields beyond the last row of hovels, their voices trailing like smoke. A day later, a child in the next hut began to cough. It was sharp and dry at first, then wet, then nothing. Then the coughing stopped. The silence after was worse. Aileen didn't light the candle that night. She wrapped the child beside her in every rag and scrap she could find, held him close, and listened. Not to him, but to everything else. The creak of beams under wind, the scratch of rats in the floor, the steady, rhythmic wheeze of her own breath. Life had become counting days, counting meals, counting who was still alive. And yet, even in all that, she still dreamed. That night she dreamed of snow, clean white snow falling over the village, covering everything, the bodies, the filth, the silence. A kind snow, a snow that made things new again. When she woke, it was just ash on the roof. By the 3rd week, no one remembered how many had died. They no longer counted. It was safer that way. The days blurred, soft-edged and thick with dread. Smoke hung in the air, not from warmth, but from burnings, of cloth, of bedding, of bodies. Every morning began with the same quiet ritual. Lift the cloth, check for breath, listen. If there was silence, you wrapped the body. If you dared, if you didn't, you waited for someone else to do it. Sometimes no one did. Aileen had taken to boiling nettles and tree bark. The concoction tasted like metal and mud, but it gave the illusion of control. She drank it slowly while the child slept, or pretended to. He spoke rarely now. When he did, it was in whispers, as if his words might spread something or summon something worse. One morning, there was shouting, not the kind that meant violence, but the kind that meant anger had finally cracked open. She stepped outside, pulling her shawl close. A man stood in the center of the square, waving a butcher's knife. His hair was wild, his tunic soaked with something too dark to be rain. He screamed about devils, about witches, about how someone in the village had cursed the land, and that was why they were dying. He pointed at a woman, Mira, the midwife, said she hadn't taken sick once, not even a cough, that she knew things she shouldn't, that she used roots to bring children into the world, and that same magic now killed them. No one stepped in. No one spoke for her. Mira stood still, a basket in her arms, eyes wide but unblinking. The man lunged, and then another. Thomas, the miller's son, tackled him. They rolled across the mud, the knife flung loose. A dog barked once, then silence returned like a blanket. Mira did not wait. She turned and walked away, barefoot, without a word. She was not seen again. That night, Aileen found a charm nailed to her door, 3 twigs tied with string, marked with soot. A warning, or a ward. It was hard to tell which. She took it down and burned it in the hearth. She didn't need protection from what was outside. Not anymore. Inside, the child whimpered in his sleep. She touched his forehead. Cool, too cool, like stone. She wrapped him tighter. The wind howled outside, knocking something loose from the roof. She didn't look. She only listened. A scream carried through the dark. Then another. And then nothing. Later, she would hear that it had been the butcher's wife. Found him hanging from the rafter with his own belt. Some said it was guilt. Others, madness. Most said nothing at all. The next morning, a notice had been posted, scratched into wood and nailed beside the chapel door. No touching, no gathering, no burials without permission, no signature, no seal, just the command. Someone had appointed themselves guardian. But of what? There was nothing left to guard. By week's end, the fever came for the blacksmith. He had been the last one still working, still making horseshoes, though no one had horses anymore, still hammering through the silence like it might keep death at bay. Aileen heard it happen. The hammer strikes slowed, then stopped, then coughing, then silence. That was the night the bell didn't ring. For the first time. And the silence that followed was not peace. It was surrender. The days grew shorter, though no one marked them. The sky remained the same dim color, whether it was morning or dusk. Time had flattened into survival. People no longer spoke of what they'd lost. They barely spoke at all. It was on such a day, unremarkable, damp, hushed, that Aileen met the monk. She was walking the edge of the village, searching for wild onion or anything that might pass for food. Her fingers were numb from cold, and her feet blistered from boots long gone soft. She heard the voice before she saw him, low, steady, singing something in Latin under his breath. He looked like death himself, robes torn, face hollow, eyes sunk deep with shadow. But his hands were clean, and he carried a satchel of dried herbs, bound with careful knots. "Peace to you," he said, stopping a few paces away. No one had said those words in weeks. Aileen didn't answer. "I've come from the east," he said, "past Marlow, where the river turned black. There are few left there." Still she said nothing. Silence had become safer than words. He looked at her, not like a man studies a woman, but like a scholar studies a text. Then he reached slowly into his satchel and held out a wrapped parcel. Inside, dried mint and barley, and something that smelled faintly sweet. "For the child," he said. "How do you know?" she began, but stopped. He smiled gently. "There is always a child." That night she boiled the herbs and barley in a clay bowl over a thread of fire. The scent filled the hut like something from another world. The child drank slowly, eyes fluttering shut before the last sip. He slept through the night. The next morning the monk was outside. He didn't ask to come in. He simply sat on a stone and began sorting roots. Aileen watched him for a long time before stepping outside. "Why are you here?" she asked. "I had nowhere else to go." It wasn't an answer, but it was enough. He introduced himself simply as Brother Aldrich. He did not speak of his monastery, nor of why he'd left it. He did not preach. He did not pray aloud. But he shared what he had: dried moss for fevers, vinegar for wounds, a bitter powder that dulled pain. Others began to notice. By the third day, a man approached, thin, limping, eyes yellowed with infection. Aldrich gave him crushed bark to chew and wrapped his foot in boiled cloth. Then came a woman, then two more, quietly, one by one. Aileen watched them come and go. Some brought eggs, others brought nothing. Aldrich never asked, and yet not all welcomed him. Tomas, the miller's son, warned her. "He's dangerous," he said. "The clean ones always are." "He heals," Aileen answered. "He observes," Tomas muttered. "And men who watch too closely bring ruin." But she did not listen. Not then. On the fifth night, another stranger arrived. He was not like Aldrich. He was broad-shouldered, hair slick with sweat, hands covered in scabs and scars. He carried a sack slung across his back, and from it he pulled jars of gray liquid and folded cloths coated in strange resin. "Trade," he said. "I've got treatments, real ones." Aldrich watched silently. The man's name was Lothar. He claimed to be an apothecary from across the mountains. He spoke quickly, laughed often, and said what people wanted to hear. "They're using leeches still, aren't they?" he scoffed. "Amateurs." His treatments worked. For a day, sometimes two. But then came rashes, shaking, bleeding gums. One girl never woke again. Still, people paid. Still, they believed. Aldrich confronted him once, quietly, calmly, and Lothar laughed in his face. That night, someone scratched the monk's name into the side of the chapel wall. Beneath it, a single word: serpent. By morning, the writing had been washed away, but not forgotten. The cold deepened, the kind that lived in the bones and never left, even near fire. Not that there was much wood left to burn. People broke apart carts now, doors, floorboards, anything that would catch a flame. The monk stayed. Lothar stayed longer. And the village began to fracture. Some followed Aldrich, quiet and slow in their hope. Others bought what they could from Lothar, who now carried silver rings on every finger and never lacked for meat or warmth. Aileen watched the shift with tired eyes. She no longer tried to convince anyone. She barely spoke. Her world had narrowed to the child, the monk, and whatever hours she could steal between them. But the fever came back, not to the child, not yet, but to a girl named Brisa, who had once braided flowers in the square and now lay still as a stone under her father's coat. Her lips turned blue by evening. Lothar gave her a syrup. She choked on it. By dawn, she was gone. That was the day the fathers began whispering of leaving. "There's another village," one said, 3 days north, across the forest. "They've a healer," said another, "and walls." "And food," added a third. No one knew if it was true, but even lies can sound like salvation when all you've known is loss. Aileen listened, quietly, and then she packed. Not much, just what she could carry: a piece of bread, a cloth bundle of dried roots from Aldrich, a strip of boiled leather for chewing. The child was light, still too thin, but stronger than weeks before. Aldrich did not argue. He handed her a map, scratched in charcoal, on old parchment. "Avoid the southern path," he said. "The river's choked with bones. Take the ridge." She nodded once. "Will you come with us?" she asked. He looked toward the sky. "My road doesn't end there." They left at dawn. Aileen, the child, 2 women, Thomas, a boy with burns on both hands, and 3 men with little to say and everything to lose. They passed through the eastern gate, what was left of it, stepping over blackened stones and the skeleton of a dog curled as if still sleeping. The wind followed them for a while, whispering through the ruins, through the chimneys, through the broken bell tower. Then the village was gone. The road was little more than a trail now, muddy and cracked, hemmed in by dead trees and vines that seemed to breathe. On the first day, it rained. On the second, a man turned back, said he'd rather die where he knew the name of every ghost. No one stopped him. They slept beneath a fallen oak, its roots half uplifted, like fingers clutching the sky. The child whimpered in the dark. Aileen held him tight and whispered stories she didn't believe. On the third day, they found what remained of a merchant's cart, splintered, burned, and empty. Blood marked the ground in short, ragged arcs. No bodies, just the smell of iron and loss. Thomas said nothing, but he sharpened his knife that night. On the 4th day, they saw smoke. A village, real, stone walls, low fires burning behind canvas, and people moving slowly, eyes cautious but not wild. A man at the edge raised a hand in warning, then beckoned. Aileen did not run. She walked. They were searched, stripped, questioned, prodded with sticks and questions. But in the end, they were allowed inside. "We've lost 37, said the woman who led them. "But we're still standing. You can help, or leave." Aileen nodded. "We'll help." And so began another kind of life. No better, but not worse. And that was enough. The village was called Elgin's Hollow, though the name wasn't carved anywhere, and few still said it aloud. It sat low in a bowl of hills, with wooden towers at each corner, and a palisade that looked stronger from a distance than it did up close. But it held, and that alone made it rare. They were given space in a barn. Not alone, 2 other families shared the straw floor. The air inside smelled of old hay, smoke, and people who had run out of tears. But it was warm, dry, quiet. For the first time in weeks, Aileen slept through the night. The child stirred beside her at dawn, rubbed his eyes, and whispered, "Is it morning?" Like it was a thing to be believed in again. The woman who led the place was called Isolde. Her hands were calloused, her eyes dark with sleeplessness, and her voice rarely rose above a murmur. She gave orders the way wind moves, constant, low, unarguable. "Everyone works," she said, "even children, if they can hold a broom." Aileen was sent to the kitchens. There was no meat, but there were turnips, onions, dried beans. The cook was a man with no fingers on his left hand and no patience on his right. But he showed her where the knives were and didn't speak when she cried cutting onions for the first time in a month. The child helped carry water. He smiled once. It startled her. At night, they were given broth, salty, thin, and the best thing she'd tasted in years. Others sat near the fire, no stories, just silence, broken by the occasional cough or the creak of boots. Tomas found work with the guards. They had few weapons, but strong arms. The boy with burns was sent to the healer, a woman with clouded eyes and a gentle touch. She taught him to wrap wounds and grind herbs. He barely spoke, but he listened. The days passed. A rhythm formed, not quite peace, but not chaos either. One evening, Aileen stood at the edge of the wall and looked out across the hills. The sky was beginning to clear. For the first time in months, she could see stars, tiny, trembling lights, like holes poked in a black curtain. Someone stood beside her, a girl, maybe 12, hair in a braid, face streaked with soot. "You came from the east," the girl said. Aileen nodded. "Was it worse there?" "Yes." The girl didn't flinch, just stared into the dark. "My mother said it'll reach us eventually, that nothing stops the plague. Not walls, not prayers." Aileen said nothing. The girl turned to her. "But you came anyway. Why?" Aileen thought for a long moment. "Because not everything dies." The girl blinked, then slowly nodded. That night, she found the child asleep with a small wooden horse in his hands, carved from scrap, roughly shaped, but clearly meant to be ridden in dreams. He whispered in his sleep, something about apples, about sun. And she smiled, just a little. The peace, such as it was, did not last. Whispers began like frost at the edges of a window, faint, then spreading. A new fever, a girl who collapsed while gathering water, a man who coughed blood into the grain bin and tried to hide it, another burial in the field outside the gate. Isolde moved quickly. She locked the outer rows, burned the linens, sent her own brother to sleep in the goat shed when he showed signs of fever. "Mercy is discipline," she said, "or it's nothing at all." But some disagreed. The younger guards grew restless. The healer questioned the methods, and Lothar returned. He came not through the gate, but through the forest trail, grinning, mounted on a mule too thin to carry him properly. His hair was shorter, his face cleaner, but the glint in his eye was unchanged. "I bring remedies," he said, "and word of trade. There are towns forming further south, ones with roads, with coin." Isolde would not let him in, so he set up camp just beyond the walls. People visited him after dark. They brought bread, blankets, whatever they could spare, and in return he gave vials, powders, tinctures. Some said they worked. Others whispered that they saw black under the fingernails of those who used them. Aileen kept her distance, but Thomas did not. She found him once near the east fence, speaking low to Lothar. They did not notice her. The look in Thomas's eyes was not fear nor trust, but something else, calculation. The next day, Isolde called a meeting, not in the square, but behind the main storehouse, where voices carried less. "We have a choice," she said. "We send him away, or we lose what we've built." Most nodded. A few did not. "Exile means nothing," one man said. "He'll return again. He always does." "Then we end it," another murmured. Aileen's stomach turned. It was decided. That night, they sent Tomas and 2 others to drive Lothar off. What happened in the woods was never fully spoken of. Thomas returned alone, his face blank, his hands empty, his tunic stained dark at the seams. No one asked questions. But something shifted after that. The healer stopped tending wounds. She packed her things and left with 2 of the younger boys. Isolde watched them go without a word. The fires burned lower. The guards checked the gates twice as often. And then one morning, the chapel was found empty. Inside, someone had scrawled in ash across the altar stone, "All flesh fails." Aileen found Thomas that night, standing by the fence, looking toward the trees. "You did it, didn't you?" she asked softly. He didn't turn. "Would you have let him stay?" "No." "Then don't ask me to feel guilt you wouldn't carry." The wind blew, and for a moment it sounded like a voice. Aileen touched his arm once, gently, then walked away. The child met her at the barn door, holding a cloth bundle. Dried fruit, a small roll, a wax-sealed letter. "A man gave me this," he said. "Said it was from the monk." Her heart caught. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside, in careful script, "You are stronger than most. But strength will not save you forever. When the snow melts, go north. Follow the river. There is light yet, in forgotten places." Signed, A. She folded the letter into her coat, heart steady. Winter was near, but so was something else. The snow came late that year, not as a storm, but as a hush, slow, deliberate, covering the hollow in soft silence. It muffled footsteps, softened the edges of ruined roofs, turned graves into gentle mounds. For a while, it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Aileen stood at the edge of the north path, the child bundled in wool beside her. He was taller now, cheeks fuller. He smiled more often, though not too wide, as if smiles might break under pressure. They had packed simply a sack of dried roots, flint and twine, a flask of broth, a map drawn in charcoal, and memory. Isolde watched them from the gate. "You could stay," she said. Aileen shook her head. "There's nothing left to guard," she answered. The gates opened. They stepped out together. The snow crunched beneath their boots. The trees glistened with frost. The river, now thin and slow, glittered under the morning sun. They walked for hours without speaking. Birds chirped once or twice. A fox watched them pass it from a distance, its breath a puff of silver. That night they made camp under an old oak. Aileen lit a small fire, wrapped the child in every scrap of warmth they had, and unfolded the letter once more. The ink was fading, but the words were still clear. She read them, aloud, softly. When the child slept, she stayed awake, eyes on the dark line of the river, on the way ahead. 2 days later, they found the orchard, or what was left of it, trees bent from age, some broken, some wild, with overgrowth. But they bore fruit, small, wrinkled, stubborn, life clinging to bare branches. A cottage stood near the edge, empty but dry. A stream ran behind it, cold and clean. No signs of plague, no signs of anything, just quiet. and space. They stayed. Spring came slow, and when it did, the ground softened. Aileen planted onions first, then turnips, then a row of beans. The child learned to fish. They carved new names into wood and hung them above the door. One morning, she found him kneeling near the edge of the garden, pressing something small into the earth. "What is it?" she asked. "An apple seed," he said. She smiled, not because it would grow, but because he believed it could. And so ends this story of shadow, of sickness, and survival. In a time when hope was rare and kindness rarer still, a woman and a child walked forward, not toward triumph, not toward glory, but toward something quieter, something gentler, something that waits for those who do not stop walking.